She laughed at me when I asked for a prenup and said only insecure men needed protection. I stayed silent and structured my holdings through a family trust before marriage. During divorce proceedings, the court upheld every clause she mocked and dismissed her claim entirely. Only insecure little men ask for prenups. She said it with a laugh. Not a nervous laugh. Not even a slightly uncomfortable laugh. A full, dismissive, chin-up, eyes-rolling laugh. Like I had just asked her to sign a permission slip before we went on a field trip. I remember the exact moment. We were sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment, the one she shared with her roommate, eating takeout pasta, and I had waited until we were both calm and full before I brought it up. I had rehearsed what I was going to say. I had thought about the timing. I had even written down some talking points in my phone's notes app, like an idiot preparing for a job interview, instead of a conversation with the woman I was supposed to marry. And she laughed. She actually laughed. Then she reached across the table, grabbed my fork, speared a piece of my pasta, ate it right in front of me, and said, "You've been watching too many divorce lawyer videos on YouTube." I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I folded the paper where I'd written down my notes, slid it back into my pocket, and said, "You're probably right." But I wasn't folding. I was just deciding to work differently. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 33 when I proposed to Nicole. We had been together for 2 years and some change. She was 30, smart, funny, and absolutely certain that she understood people better than anyone else in the room, at all times, in all situations, without exception. I had a construction company I had been building since I was 26. Not a massive empire, not a name you'd recognize, but solid. Commercial contracts, he said. I don't know her. I know you. I know what you've built. And I know that without documentation, what you've built doesn't automatically stay yours. Simple enough logic. I agreed. So I brought it up over dinner. And she laughed. And I said, "You're probably right." And Victor, when I called him the next morning and told him how it went, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay, let's talk about a different approach." The family trust had been something Victor and I had discussed in passing before, not in the context of marriage, but in the context of my business growing in complexity. As a business owner, you reach a certain point where the way you hold assets matters as much as the assets themselves. My company operated under an LLC, but my personal holdings, the warehouse, the residential co-ownership stake, the investment accounts, and the house, those were all in my personal name. Simple. Exposed. Victor and I had talked about restructuring for estate planning purposes. The prenup rejection just moved that conversation up on the calendar. Over the following 3 months, with Victor and a second specialist he brought in who focused specifically on trust structures, I moved my personal holdings into a properly established family trust. The trust was not hidden. It was not fraudulent. It was not a trick. Everything was documented, filed, disclosed, above board in every legal sense. The trust listed my parents as secondary beneficiaries, as is completely standard for this type of structure when children aren't yet in the picture. The company remained under its LLC. The investment accounts were assigned to the trust as the holding entity. The warehouse property was deeded into the trust. The residential co-ownership stake was assigned through a legally clean transfer. The house, the one Nicole and I would live in after the wedding, remained in my personal name, but with a clear paper trail showing its acquisition date and source of funds predated our relationship. Victor said, "This is not a prenup. This is just responsible asset structuring. Courts see this every day." He was right. He would be proven right in ways neither of us fully anticipated at the time. Nicole and I got married on a Saturday in October. The venue was a converted barn outside the city, her choice, and genuinely beautiful. About 140 guests. Her parents, her sister, her work friends, her college roommates. My business partner, my parents, my 2 closest friends from high school, who had somehow both ended up in the same city as me. It was a good day. I want to be honest about that. Whatever came after, it was a good day. She cried during the vows. I didn't, but I came close. We danced badly and laughed about it. We stayed up until 2 in the morning at the after party talking to people we hadn't seen in years. There were no red flags waving that night. Or maybe there were, and I was just choosing not to look. The first year of marriage was fine. Fine is doing a lot of work in that sentence, but it's the right word. We settled into the house. She had her job. I had my company. We cooked together on weekends. We argued about small things, whose turn it was to call the plumber, whether the thermostat should be at 68 or 70, who had agreed to go to which family event. Normal friction. Livable friction. The second year is where things started shifting in ways I noticed, but couldn't immediately name. Nicole's firm went through a restructuring. She kept her job, but the title changed, the team under her shrank, and 2 colleagues she had considered rivals got promoted into positions above her. She didn't take it well. She was not wrong to be frustrated. The restructuring did seem unfair from what she described. But the frustration didn't stay at work. It came home. It spread into how she talked about money, into how she talked about my business, into comments that started arriving sideways. Not accusations exactly, but questions shaped like accusations. Must be nice to just own things and watch them grow. Not all of us got handed a head start. I had not been handed anything. My parents were solidly middle class. My father worked in facilities management his whole career. My mother was a school nurse. I had taken out a small business loan at 26, worked 12-hour days for 3 years, and reinvested nearly everything I made for the first 4 years of the company's existence. I had not been handed a head start. I had built one, slowly, while living on almost nothing and making decisions that most people my age thought were either boring or paranoid. But I didn't say that every time she made a comment like that, because it would have started an argument, and I was still trying to believe the frustration was just temporary. The third year was harder. Her dissatisfaction with her career had calcified into something I can only describe as ambient resentment. She started going out more with her work friends, a group that included a recently divorced woman named Diane, who had a very particular way of discussing her ex-husband that always made me slightly uneasy. Not because I suspected anything, just because Diane's specific worldview, that men were inherently withholding, that financial security in a marriage was something women had to fight to extract, had started appearing in Nicole's vocabulary. Phrases I hadn't heard her use before started showing up. We should look into what a spouse is entitled to in this state. Said casually, over breakfast, like it was a passing thought. I said, why are you thinking about that? She shrugged and said, Diane was telling me about what she went through. Just interesting. I nodded. I went to work. I called Victor from the parking lot and told him about the conversation. Victor said, how's everything else? I said, not great. He said, come in this week. Victor and I met on a Thursday afternoon. He reviewed the trust structure, confirmed everything was still clean and properly documented, and walked me through a few scenarios. He said, if it came to that, and I'm not saying it will, everything in the trust is protected by virtue of when it was established, how it was established, and the clear premarital origin of the assets placed into it. He paused. The house is the one exposure point. But again, clear premarital acquisition and the deed documentation is solid. I said, what about contributions she's made? Shared expenses. He said, we'll document everything carefully going forward. Keep your accounts separate. Make sure shared household costs come through a joint account that you both fund proportionally. I had already been doing most of that. We tightened it up. I went home that night and made dinner. Nicole came home at 8, said she'd eaten with Diane, kissed me on the cheek, and went to take a bath. I sat in the kitchen and ate by myself. The fourth year is the one I won't go into with too much detail. Not because it's too painful, more because the specific events feel less important than the pattern they formed. We argued more. The arguments were no longer about thermostats. They were about direction, about what kind of life we were building, about what she felt she deserved, about what I was or wasn't providing emotionally, financially, symbolically. She had started making comments about how the house should be in both names. I explained, calmly, that the house had been acquired before we married. She said, that doesn't matter once you're married. Everything becomes shared. I said, that's not exactly how it works legally. She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Something between suspicion and calculation. She said, you've thought about this a lot, haven't you? It wasn't a question. I said, I think about things. Yes. She brought up the prenup conversation again in the 5th year. Not as a laugh this time, as an accusation. We were in the middle of a fight about something else entirely. I don't even remember what started it. And she said, you know what? You never really trusted me. You wanted that prenup because you already knew you were going to keep everything yours. I said, you laughed at the idea of a prenup. She said, because I trusted you. I said, and I trusted you enough to marry you without one. She said, but you did something, didn't you? I don't know what. But you did something. Because you're always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, and it makes me feel like a fool. I didn't answer that. She wasn't wrong. I was 10 steps ahead. I just wasn't doing it to fool her. I was doing it because I had watched too many people lose things they'd spent their entire adult lives building, simply because they hadn't structured things properly. She filed in the spring of the 6th year. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even devastated in the way I thought I'd be. I was tired. I was sad in the slow, dull way that comes when something has been ending for a long time and you finally just allow it to officially end. She had a lawyer, a woman named Renata who had a reputation in this city for aggressive asset division. Renata had clearly done her homework. Or tried to. The initial filing from Nicole's side listed claims against the company, the investment accounts, the warehouse property, the residential co-ownership stake, and the house. She wanted half, which is what people want when they believe half is theirs to ask for. Victor reviewed the filing and called me. He said, "They're going to have a problem." I said, "Walk me through it." He said, "The company is an LLC with a clear premarital establishment date, documented operating history, and you as the sole member. Marital contribution claims against it will be difficult without evidence she materially contributed to its growth, which she didn't, by any documented measure." I said, "The accounts." He said, "In the trust. The trust predates the marriage. The assets placed in the trust have clear documented premarital origins. Renata's going to argue constructive fraud or improper transfer. She'll claim you hid assets, but the documentation trail is going to bury that argument before it starts." I said, "The house." He said, "Premarital acquisition, purchase date documented, source of funds traceable. She might argue appreciation value during the marriage, but even that has limited exposure given how we structured the shared account contributions." He paused. "This is why we did what we did." Renata filed a motion claiming I had used the family trust as a fraudulent vehicle to conceal marital assets. She argued that the timing of the trust, established shortly after Nicole and I got engaged, was evidence of bad faith. She argued that assets placed into the trust should be considered marital property because the marriage was the motivating event for the restructuring. It was a clever argument. It was not a winning argument. Victor, along with a litigation partner he brought in named Owen who specialized in trust and estate disputes, prepared a response that was, in my admittedly biased opinion, a thing of beauty. Every document was filed. Every disclosure was timestamped. The trust had been established in compliance with state law. The assets transferred into it had clear premarital acquisition dates. The purpose of the trust, as stated in its own establishment documents, was estate planning and business asset protection, predating any marital circumstances. Victor had even documented, in the original trust paperwork, a reference to ongoing estate planning discussions that had started 2 years before my engagement to Nicole. Because they had. We had actually discussed the trust framework as part of general business planning. The engagement just accelerated the timeline. That detail alone effectively neutralized the timing equals fraud argument. There was a deposition. I sat across a table from Renata and answered questions for 4 hours. She was sharp, methodical. She tried several angles. She asked whether I had deliberately withheld information about my financial structure from Nicole during our marriage. I said I had never hidden assets. I said the trust was a matter of public record, properly filed, properly disclosed in the context of our divorce proceedings. She asked whether Nicole had ever been made aware of the trust's existence. I said the trust existed as a legally established entity. She asked whether I had specifically told Nicole about it. I said we had not had a detailed financial disclosure conversation prior to marriage, because Nicole had declined to engage with the prenup discussion when I raised it. Renata paused. She looked at her notes. She said, "You tried to get a prenup." I said yes. She said, "And she declined." I said, "She found the idea funny." Renata wrote something down. I don't know exactly what she wrote, but I imagine it was something like, "This is going to be harder than I thought." The court date was on a Tuesday in November. I wore a gray suit. Nicole was across the room, and she looked tired in a way that made me feel something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not anger, just a kind of worn-out grief for both of us. Whatever she had become in year 3 and year 4 and year 5, she had not always been that person. The woman in the burgundy dress at the charity auction, bidding on a cabin she didn't need because she liked winning. That person had been real too. I had loved that person. I don't think I'd fully stopped. But love and legal exposure are 2 completely separate categories of problem. and confusing them is how people end up losing everything. The judge reviewed the filings. Renata made her arguments. Owen, representing me, responded with documentation. The judge asked several pointed questions about the trust's establishment timeline. Owen walked through the paper trail clearly and calmly. The judge asked whether there was any evidence that assets had been moved into the trust after the marriage commenced. Owen confirmed, no. All transfers had occurred prior to the wedding date. All transfers were documented. All assets had clearly traceable premarital origins. The judge then turned to the claim against the house. Renata argued that Nicole had contributed to the household, had made lifestyle sacrifices, had co-inhabited the property, and thus had a legitimate equitable interest in any appreciation. Owen acknowledged the general principle and then walked through the shared account records. Every joint household expense had been funded through the shared account, which both parties contributed to proportionally based on income. There was no documented instance of Nicole's personal funds being applied directly to the mortgage, which had been paid through the trust-linked account from day one. The appreciation argument had limited ground. The judge took a recess. When court resumed, the ruling came in sections. The company, protected under its LLC structure, no evidence of marital contribution sufficient to establish a claim. The investment accounts, protected under the trust structure, trust establishment predating the marriage and properly documented. The warehouse property, protected under the trust, same reasoning. The residential co-ownership stake, protected under the trust. The house, awarded to me with a modest settlement figure attached, an acknowledgement of Nicole's cohabitation years, but nowhere near the half-value claim Renata had filed. Every clause that Nicole had laughed at, every structure she had mocked as the product of an insecure man, every framework that Renata had called fraudulent, upheld. Every single one. Nicole's claim was not dismissed in a dramatic, movie moment fashion. It was dismissed methodically, piece by piece, with the quiet efficiency of a system that follows documentation the way water follows gravity. I want to tell you about the moment she said it. Not the laugh at the kitchen table. I've already told you about that one. I mean the moment outside the courthouse. We passed each other near the entrance after the proceedings had concluded. Renata was behind Nicole, already on her phone. Nicole looked at me. She said, "You planned all of this." I said, "I protected what I built." She said, "You protected it from me." I said, "I protected it from a situation that I hoped would never happen. And it happened anyway." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I really did love you." I said, "I know. I loved you too." She said, "Then why did you do it this way? Why didn't you just trust me?" I said, "You laughed, Nicole. I came to you with a reasonable request, and you laughed and told me only insecure men needed that kind of protection. I tried to have the conversation. You told me it wasn't necessary." She said, "So you went around me." I said, "I went around the risk." She opened her mouth, closed it, nodded once, not in agreement, but in some kind of private acknowledgement of something she couldn't quite say out loud. Then she walked to her car, and I walked to mine. I want to back up now, because I've given you the outcome, but I haven't given you enough of the architecture, the full picture of why the decisions made sense, why I made them when I did, and why this wasn't just some coldly calculated revenge plot against a woman I'd stopped loving. It was simpler and more boring than that. I had been through this before. Not personally, but close enough. My uncle, my mother's brother, a man named Gerald who had spent 20 years building a small chain of auto repair shops across 3 counties, went through a divorce at 51. I was 22 at the time. I watched it happen. Gerald had built everything from scratch. He had started with one shop, a rented bay, and a reputation for not overcharging customers. By the time he was 50, he had 4 locations, a solid customer base, and had just signed a lease on a 5th. His wife, a perfectly pleasant woman who had also worked hard, who had raised their 2 kids largely while Gerald was absorbed in the business, filed for divorce. And because Gerald had never structured anything, because the businesses were in his personal name, because there were no operating agreements that clearly delineated what was built before the marriage and what was built during it, the divorce consumed him. Not because the judge was unfair, because there was no documentation to tell the story of what had existed before the marriage and what had come after. He lost 2 of the shops. He lost the house. He lost most of what he'd spent his life building, not because anyone stole it from him, but because in the absence of structure, the law defaults to a very blunt set of assumptions. I was 22 when I watched that happen. I was 26 when I started my own company. And the first thing I did before I took on a single client, before I hired a single worker, before I signed a single contract, was sit down with a business attorney and structure things properly. That attorney was not Victor. But when Victor came into my professional life 5 years later, the foundation was already there. He just helped me build on top of it intelligently. None of what I did was about Nicole specifically. I want to be clear about that. I did not fall in love with Nicole and then start planning for her to fail. I did not propose to her while secretly cataloging ways to limit her options. I proposed to her because I genuinely wanted to build a life with her. I asked for the prenup because Victor had told me it was the cleanest, most straightforward way to protect both of us. Yes, both of us. Because a prenup works in 2 directions, and because any rational adult with assets should have that conversation before marriage. She laughed. She made me feel small for asking. She used language, insecure little men, that was designed to shame me out of the conversation. And it worked. In the moment. But I am not, and have never been, a person who lets a shaming comment in the moment override a reasonable decision in the long run. I just learned to have the conversation with Victor instead. There's something I've thought about a lot since the divorce. The question of whether I handled it the right way. Not legally. Legally, clearly, I handled it correctly. But personally, relationally, was there a version of that conversation at the kitchen table that ended differently? Could I have framed it better? Could I have made her understand that the prenup wasn't about distrust, that it was about documentation, about clarity, about the kind of structural honesty that actually protects both people? Maybe. Probably. I think about the version of me who pushed harder in that conversation instead of folding. I think about whether that version of the conversation might have changed something, not just about the prenup, but about how we entered the marriage. Because here's the thing about that laugh. It wasn't just about the prenup. It was a signal about how she would handle financial conversations in general. A signal that her emotional response to money and ownership and security was connected to ideas about control and power that weren't fully examined. A signal that she had never really had to sit down and think clearly about what she was building toward, because she expected that a successful man would just provide the structure and she would move into it. If I had pushed that conversation, if I had said, "I'm not going to let this go, and here's why," maybe we would have uncovered those incompatibilities before the wedding instead of after. Maybe we would have both walked away then, saved 6 years of gradual corrosion. Or maybe she would have pushed back, and we would have found our way through it and built something real. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that I didn't push. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. And that decision, the decision to stop trying to have the honest conversation and start building quietly instead, that decision protected my financial life and probably ended my marriage in slow motion. Victor threw a small retirement party for his longtime assistant the month after the divorce was finalized. He invited a few clients. I went. We stood by a window with drinks, looking out at the city, and he said, "You know what this case reminded me of?" I said, "What?" He said, "People always think the law is dramatic, like it's going to come down to one moment, one argument, one piece of evidence that turns everything." He shook his head. It almost never is. It's almost always documentation. Paper. Dates and paper. I said, "Romantic." He laughed. He said, "That's what I've been telling clients for 30 years. Build something properly or don't build it at all." I said, "She called it insecure." He said, "I know." I said, "She wasn't entirely wrong, I think. There is a kind of fear underneath all of it. Fear of losing what you built." He said, "Is that insecurity?" I thought about it. I said, "I don't know. I think there's a version of it that's insecurity. The version where you can't trust anyone, where you're always protecting yourself from imaginary enemies." I paused. "And then there's a version where you've watched someone lose everything because they didn't have the right papers, and you just decide that's not going to be you." Victor looked at me. He said, "You were 22 when your uncle went through his divorce." "Yeah. And you've been building the structure ever since." Something like that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She didn't lose because the law was cruel to her. She lost because she refused to participate in the conversation that would have given her protection too. A prenup would have formalized her rights as much as yours." I said, "I tried to tell her that." He said, "I know. You told me." After the divorce, I sold the warehouse property. Not because I needed to, because I had been holding it for 7 years and the market had moved in a direction that made selling feel intelligent. I used part of the proceeds to refinance some business debt at a lower rate. I put the rest into the trust. I took a week off. I went somewhere quiet. A place on the coast with no particular significance except that a friend had recommended it, and I needed somewhere that had no associations, no memories attached. I walked on a beach for 4 days. I ate at restaurants where no one knew me. I slept better than I had in 2 years. I'm not going to tell you I came back transformed. I didn't come back with a new philosophy or a lesson worth stitching onto a pillow. I came back with a cleaner sense of what I was working toward. The company needed some attention. There were 2 projects I had been half managing while the divorce consumed my bandwidth, and they needed proper focus. I put that focus back in. By the end of the year, both projects were closed at margins better than projected. My business partner, a straightforward man named Derek who had been with me in a limited capacity since year 3 of the company, asked me over drinks if I was doing okay. I said, yeah, actually. He said, you seem different. I said, better or worse? He said, settled. I thought that was probably the right word. I did start dating again, eventually. Not right away. Not as a statement or a rebound or a signal to anyone. Just gradually. In the way that life continues when you stop trying to force it backward. I met a woman named Claire at a conference. She worked in commercial real estate, which meant we had overlapping professional vocabulary and roughly similar frameworks for how we thought about risk. On the 3rd date, she asked about my previous marriage. I gave her the summary version. She said, did you have a prenup? I said, I tried. She didn't want to have the conversation. Claire looked at me steadily. She said, I would want one. For both of us. I looked at her. She said, I have assets too. A prenup protects both people. That's just logical. I said, you'd be surprised how many people don't see it that way. She said, I know. I've seen what happens to people who skip it. It's not pretty. I liked her very much in that moment. Not because she said the right thing in any strategic sense, but because she said the thing that indicated we had the same basic understanding of how adults should approach shared financial lives. That's not a small thing. That might actually be the most important thing. I'm not writing this to tell you that I'm smarter than anyone. I'm not writing this to tell you that I outsmarted my ex-wife or won some game that was rigged against her. I'm writing it because I genuinely believe most people, men and women both, go into marriage without having the structural conversation and then are shocked when the absence of structure becomes the catastrophe. A prenup is not a document that says, I don't trust you. A prenup is a document that says, I respect both of us enough to be honest about what we're each bringing to this, and I want us both protected regardless of what happens. That's what I tried to say at the kitchen table. That's what got laughed at. And what happened next? The trust, the structure, the years of careful documentation. That was not a revenge plan. That was just a person who had watched his uncle go through a slow financial destruction taking reasonable steps to make sure the same thing didn't happen to him. The law upheld those steps. Not because I was clever. Because I had documentation. Dates and paper. That's all it ever is. Nicole and I had one more interaction after the courthouse. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized. She emailed me. I wasn't expecting it. The subject line was just a single word, a name she'd always used for me privately, which felt strange, seeing just that one word sitting there in my inbox like a door standing open in an empty house. The email was short. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. She said she didn't blame me for protecting what I had built. She said she was angry for a long time. At me, at the outcome, at herself, but that the anger had started to wear down into something more like understanding. She said the thing that had stayed with her most was something I said on the courthouse steps. I went around the risk. She said she had rolled that sentence over in her mind many times, and she had eventually realized that the risk I was going around was not her. It was the version of things that could go wrong, regardless of who was involved. She said she thought she had made herself into the symbol of that risk in her own mind, and that it had made her angrier than was fair. She ended the email by saying she hoped I was well. I sat with it for a full day before I responded. I kept my response short. I said I hoped she was well too. I said I meant it. I said I didn't hold anything against her. I said, the prenup conversation could have gone differently. I think we both know that. She wrote back once more. Just 3 words. Yeah, we do. The company turned 11 years old last spring. We took on a new commercial contract that's the largest in our history. Derek and I went to dinner to market. We ordered something expensive, and I didn't look at the bill. On the way home, driving through the city at night with the radio playing something I didn't recognize and the windows cracked just enough to feel the air, I thought about my Uncle Gerald. I thought about the version of him who had done it differently, who had structured things before they needed to be structured, who had been able to keep his shops, keep his house, keep what he built, and also share what he built with the people he loved, properly, clearly, with full documentation on both sides. That version of Gerald didn't have to lose 2 shops and start over at 51. That version of Gerald got to just go on being Gerald. I thought, that's what I'm trying to be. Not the man who wins. Not the man who outmaneuvers. Just the man who built something real and kept it real from the beginning with the right papers in the right order. That's not a dramatic thing. It's actually a very quiet thing. But quiet tends to be durable. And durable, in the long run, beats loud every single time. One last thing. There's a version of this story that gets told differently. The version where I'm the villain. The cold, calculating man who went into his marriage already building the exit, already preparing his defenses, already treating love like a liability instead of a commitment. I've heard that version. Some people in Nicole's circle told it that way. It spread the way those stories spread, with just enough surface-level plausibility to travel, finding ears that were already inclined to hear it. I'm not going to argue with it too hard, partly because I think everyone is the villain in someone else's version of events, partly because I recognize that my willingness to build quietly, to protect things in the background while smiling at wedding dinners, is not exactly the portrait of a man who led with vulnerability and openness. I know what I did, and I know why I did it. I came to the conversation honestly. I was laughed out of the room. I adapted. The law agreed with my adaptation. That's the whole story. Not a story about a hero. Not a story about a villain. A story about a man who watched someone lose everything and decided that wasn't going to be him. A story about dates and paper. A story about a laugh at a kitchen table that sent things in a direction neither of us fully understood at the time. A story that ended in a courtroom, quietly, with documents that no one mocked. Because you cannot laugh at documentation. Documentation just sits there, patient, waiting, for as long as it takes.